The Liberty Weekly podcast is brought to you by Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom. Sick of losing arguments with your statist friends? Fear no more. Now you can vanquish your intellectual foes with courses taught by top libertarian professors. Tool your intellectual arsenal and enroll today by navigating to www.libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom or by following the link in the show notes page.
To me, my one discovery, my one great epiphany, my one aha moment that I said, I got it. I see what exactly happened with in this country. The Frankfurt School were emigres from
Germany.
Germany. It was the equivalent of this, the Hoover Institution. What the Hoover Institution is to Stanford University, the Frankfurt School was a think tank at the University of Frankfurt, and they were social scientists like Herbert Marcuse, Antonio Gramsci, Horkheimer, Adorno. These were all a bunch of guys in the middle of World War II who had suffered in Europe, 2 world wars in a row, and they had been fighting, the Nazis, and they were trying to figure out another aspect of how to how to spread Marxism around the world. You could go to Bolivia, you could go to Bulgaria, and you could go to the peasant class, and you could say, let's flip this place. The Marxist-Stalinist argument of getting the workers to get upset at the owners was very easy, but not in America, where the middle class was invested in their productivity, invested in the concept that they could have their own small little American dream, a white picket fence, that they could invent something and go from one generation of being dirt poor to being an owner within a very quick period of time. And what these guys figured out when they came to the United States, and Adorno is the one that drives me the most crazy. He came out to California. I think it was Bertolt Brecht, the East German playwright, that moved to Santa Monica in the 1940s at the height of the Golden Age. Think about this. These guys left Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy to come to California in the 1940s, and they lived by the beach, and they were depressed by the relentless cheeriness, the productivity, and the capitalism that they witnessed around them. And they came up with at the end of the day, we could call it cultural Marxism, but at the end of the day, we experience it on a day-to-day basis. And by that I mean a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis. It's political correctness and it's multiculturalism. And what it took was this amazing concept of e pluribus unum, where everybody comes here and contributes to this, everybody becomes an American and contributes, but we have a common culture, we have a common border, a common mindset. What they did was take the haves versus have-nots friction and translated it into oppressor versus the oppressed.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, Patrick McFarland, and joining me again is the co-host, Jerry McCullum. Jerry?
Thank you, Pat.
Okay, so for today's episode, we have one simple question, and that question is politics downstream from culture? And framing that question is to explain it a little more, at least the way that I understand it, because it's something that I've heard been thrown around quite a bit in the past little bit here, is the idea that culture matters because politics is downstream. I guess it's pretty self-explanatory. Mm-hmm. So what do you think, Jerry?
Well, we talked about this before we got on the mic, and I came to the conclusion that I think it's a conversation. I think that a lot of times they're dictating to each other. So it's not necessarily, I don't think it's downstream. I think it's a pool, you might say. Because I think that there are influences. I think there are times when politics and political figures are the ones that are dictating culture and their actions are dictating culture. And there are times when it is culture that is setting the limits of what politics can be. I think both happen.
Yeah, so let's give an example of politics affecting culture. I'm putting you on the spot.
You are putting me on the spot. This is one that's maybe a little bit, it doesn't affect culture in such a big way, but if you take example of after 9/11, Homeland Security, NSA, that sort of thing. Now, our culture is a lot more okay with being spied on, and we have a lot less issue with things like the TSA now. And now it's just kind of seen as something that we have to deal with. And the common person, I think at least, doesn't spew vitriol about the TSA. They're just sort of accepted as a nuisance now. And I think that's an example of the most explicit kind of politics affecting culture, where policy is made and then people have to deal with it. And so I think that's, and admittedly, it's a relatively small effect on culture compared to other things. Like, it's not like a philosophy or something like that. But I think that's like the most explicit example. Another one that people talk about quite a bit, not so much us, but like people talk about the Frankfurt School and postmodernism and academia affecting how people think. And I think there is some truth to that, although, and sometimes I think this is something I haven't looked into enough, but I suspect that it's overblown sometimes. But there are a lot of, all the biggest politicians and many leaders of industry within our country have all come from Ivy League institutions that have apparently this, postmodernist ideals and philosophy behind them, which definitely affects what people who, what they talk about or what they say is something that affects people. And, if, for example, we use something like Facebook, there's certain things that are allowed on Facebook. There's only certain kinds of there's definitely a bias in what kind of content is curtailed, usually more targeting the conservative side of things. And that's something that the effect of social media is something that definitely can change culture. It is, it has a huge effect on what the culture of the people who use it is. So I think that the kind of quasi-political, the corporate, there are corporatist organizations like Facebook and Google in some areas, but Twitter, that have a lot of interaction with regulatory agencies, and those have, especially recently, have started to curtail what is allowable opinion online, and I think that has a huge effect on culture as well.
Yeah, I think it does too. But to narrow the scope, I think the context in which that I've heard this argument or this statement or this observation be made is from a libertarian or an ANCAP standpoint. How do we affect change in our, paradigm? Mm-hmm. And I think that if the observation, I think from that standpoint is true, that, how do we as libertarians, we have to win the culture war in a certain sense, which,
because we're not going to win the political war, at least on the countrywide scale.
And I think that if you're trying to scale back the state, you can't do it. And I think that's the observation, is that if the state is your enemy, you can't change it by getting a hold of the state. So what other option do we have? We know that if we do change culture, the politics will follow. I think that's a true observation.
I think in some ways, there is, what is allowable is definitely curtailed by culture in some ways, but I would not say that politics is a slave to culture at all. And the example that I would use would be the recent election, where right now there's a really strong theme of anti-establishmentism, if that's a word, within especially the youth, and they want to express that in their voting, and they're denied that by the Democratic Party. And the person that won in the Republican Party was, the one that was the outsider, the one that the mainstream Republicans hated and didn't like. It's the majority of Republicans that I know hate Trump, or maybe not hate, but really dislike him. And so I guess this is more of an example of a bit of a conversation happening where the powers that be did their best to deny an anti-establishment candidate from happening. They didn't go all the way. Obviously, Trump got elected, although now Trump is just
not anti-establishment
anymore. He's just a globalist now, unfortunately. so I think that's a case of the culture and politics fighting each other and getting a result that everyone's dissatisfied with.
Well, I'm just trying to think of so one situation of it's so nuanced. We were throwing around the situation before where I was confronted with the question of whether or not I would ever be a prosecutor. Mm-hmm. You remember this conversation we had a few weeks ago? And I was like, well, I want to legalize drugs in whatever county. Mm-hmm. That's what I would want to do. And I would refuse to prosecute victim crimes. And the legality or feasibility of that is in question. But let's say that I do somehow become prosecutor or the district attorney of a certain county, and let's say I'm unchallenged, but I do decide to completely legalize everything.
All right, what a de facto legalization? I'm
de facto, yeah, I suppose. Well, no, let's say we could take one county, and even though we don't have the support of the populace, we just decide to make it Ancapistan, or even just Ancapistan with this one little caveat. Do you think that would work?
I don't. Yeah, I don't think so.
I don't either. And so. But from our standpoint, that would be politics trying to go upstream to influence the culture.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean when you because I do think that politics have an effect on culture and not just the other way around. And the one example that you gave was 9/11, right?
Yeah.
But I think it was the event itself. So 9/11 came about because. Well, for us, because we don't believe the official story, we think that, was it a political act? Was the terrorism a political act that was created? If you're conspiratorial, which I think is the true story, but if, Bush did 9/11 or FBI, insert organization name here or web of whatever, that's beside the point. It was still a political act. It was still a political creation. I guess you could say World War II was a political creation too, or the World War I. And I do think that influences culture.
Yeah. I think maybe a way to put it is that libertarian goals, like big libertarian goals, are probably only, or maybe not libertarian, but big voluntarist goals are probably only achievable downstream is maybe a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Because although I think that, what Adam Koch is doing as the not for president kind of thing, I think it would be a really exciting and interesting publicity stunt, but I do not think that it would be, if he became not for president, I don't think that would be very successful, if that makes sense. Now, I think it certainly would be exciting, and I legitimately would prefer it over probably anything else, except for maybe The Rock becoming the president. That's just too good.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that would, although I definitely think that like the balkanization of the United States in the long term would probably lead to there being some areas in the United States that would be significantly freer. I would suspect that the country on the whole would not drift towards freedom or authoritarianism, if that makes sense. It may be, California goes full socialist, while places like New Hampshire or Idaho go significantly more libertarian. And that, at least for us, that would probably be great, because then we could just move there, but I don't think that it would be something that would make the United States significantly freer in your day-to-day life overall. And I don't think that it would have a huge effect on I don't think that it would make people like reject the ideas of nationalism or government by dissolving the federal government. Oh, I should say that just in case people don't know, the Adam Koch not for president thing is Adam Koch is running for president in 2020 under the platform that I believe it's immediately or as soon as possible that he would
an immediate peaceful dissolution of the federal government.
Yeah.
And I think that, since the way that I think Adam is going to frame it is be like, okay, well, this is a national referendum on the existence of the federal government. And I think that if if he were to somehow get elected and carry that out,
Yeah.
I think I'd be a little more hopeful, because then at least I think it'd be demonstrative of a cultural change. Is that this political act, if there's enough popular will to get him elected, then it would be demonstrative of a cultural change trending in the direction of anti-authoritarianism.
Yeah, absolutely. But if we're talking about theoreticals here, if it wasn't that people voted him in because they all believed it, but some magic fairy came in and made him win, something ridiculous like that, or there was like a virus in all the polling machines and he won or something like that, I don't think that it would make the culture of the United States as a whole trend libertarian.
Yeah. And I think that's the agreement that we have, is that you can't none of that anti-authoritarianism is going to come from a political event, because people don't respond to that kind of event unless
it's reactionary.
Yeah.
Like unless it's like some people did something really terrible and then everyone's like, God, that's awful.
Yeah. But we don't see that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
even when there's things like civil asset forfeiture, which is just so clearly piracy.
Yeah.
And I mean that in like the high seas kind of piracy, but people are just, there isn't a huge outcry. There's not, people protesting about this, at least from what I've seen. It's just articles online and people being like, wow, that's terrible and awful, but it hasn't galvanized the public.
Yeah, people respond from a place of fear and outrage. And I don't think that there's enough people that are outraged enough to, and they respond to immediate threats to themselves and their property. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'm not very optimistic about the whole. Well, another thing I wanted to, unless you have more on that point.
I don't think so.
Okay.
And a counterpoint that you have to this idea of culture being downstream is
the Fed's influence on culture and the influence of cheap money proliferating throughout the economy and cheap credit. Mm-hmm. And
because it's definitely a political decision that's affecting the, how people within the economy act and the culture of entrepreneurs and investors.
Yeah, and consumers too, because one thing that I think is, if there's all this cheap loans available and everyone's buying things on credit, and all these consumers and children grow up having more material possessions that they didn't necessarily have to work for. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, this is just kind of anecdotal on my part, but I've often kind of thought about the instant gratification culture that has been encouraged by the Federal Reserve, pumping cheap money and credit through the economy. And
mm-hmm. by making investments, usually, keeping your money in the bank, that sort of thing, is usually something that is not worthwhile anymore. Like, anecdotal, but one of my aunts is actually sending me some money, and her explicit reason is that she does not get any interest in her bank account. She is sending it to someone young and relatively poor and broke, so I'll do something with it. That's what she said. So even people who are older now, that's affecting how they use their money. That was just anecdotally, but I absolutely see that there is people are not interested in investing.
Yeah, and I was talking to Megan about this the other night, about how in the past, before the Federal Reserve and the history might be a little screwed up, but before the Federal Reserve, it used to be that the American dollar was deflationary, so that normal ass people didn't have to have an investment broker to save for their retirement, because they knew that in 20 years my money is going to be worth like 20% more than it is now, or it's going to buy more at least. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, could you imagine doing that now? Is that, I know that all I have to do is hold on to my money, and in 20 years it'll be worth more.
If only.
Yeah. But that'll cause the deflationary spiral, and no one will buy anything because they know it'll just be cheaper in 2 years. That was sarcasm. Like, I mean, take it with phones, every year a better phone comes out that's, well, maybe not anymore, that's cheaper. Mm-hmm. But at least with electronics, they keep getting cheaper all the time, and people will still buy
Or
it.
with phones, it's your money has more purchasing power each year when it comes to that. And it's not like that industry is failing or anything like that. I'm not sure about phones specifically, but for sure the electronics industry as a whole is huge, and it's really important. It's a big deal, and it's inherently deflationary. And the deflationary spiral is
It's just ridiculous. Yeah. I don't have anything, I guess, else for the Fed's influence on cheap money and credit than just giving millennials as an anecdotal evidence. I mean, all the bad tropes, but we've kind of stuck up for our own generation. I love to pick on millennials, but
I mean, maybe I have. I don't know if we've done this on air or not, but in my opinion, the whole millennial thing is just old people taking a shit on young people, and it's something that's happened throughout the ages. It's something that I'm pretty sure Socrates did it. It's something that everyone has always done. They've talked about how the youth are shitty and they don't appreciate the important values, and they're spoiled, and it's just the nature of being human is to look at the generation that comes after you and think that it's lesser than you.
yeah.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, I can see that definitely. But I think there is a case to be made, though, that not just the millennials, though, but also the baby boomers being shitty and terrible, because they are.
I think it's also a part of human culture to shit on your parents' generation, too.
Oh, don't.
Just going to say that.
Don't peg me. Wait, pegging has a totally different... Never mind. Don't paint me in that corner. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think my parents are baby boomers, though. I think they're the generation between baby boomers and millennials. Is that Gen X?
No.
Or is Gen X the next one? Oh, well. This is collectivist language anyways.
Yeah.
So we like to, analyze things from an individual perspective.
My parents saved money.
Yeah.
They maybe got a lot of subsidies from the government in certain ways, but they saved money.
Yeah,
that's all I have to say.
Yeah,
with my parents.
So there's not, like I said with the whole, there's not too much to unpack with just spitballing at.
I think the most important thing to recognize is that the statement is only true within a particular context, and that is if we are looking to if we're looking to get political change towards libertarianism ideals, it's something that is going to come from culture first. And even then, it may be something that ends up being culture only. Like if you look at how big of a deal Ron Paul was and how unfortunately little that came of, how little policy came of it.
Yeah, and lasting. I mean, I guess the
legacy of it is all the people who have come to libertarianism and capism from that.
Yeah.
But I don't know of any policy that was really obviously libertarian that happened because of it. Maybe it's a lack of policy that happened that we just can't see.
I think that would be more correct.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, would Ron Paul running for president, would that be an example of politics affecting culture? I think it would.
Yeah, you're right.
Because he didn't. You could get down to the nitty gritty of it.
It's the political theater.
Yeah.
I guess it's how you define politics in this case.
Yeah. Or would Ron Paul be a cultural thing?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe he would be, because if you are defining political acts as being the use of violence to instigate change in society,
if you're thinking of it as policy, then you would be mostly culture. You'd be a cultural phenomenon, not a political one. But yeah, it depends on definitions in that case.
Yeah. And I honestly, I can't think of a situation in which politics would be affecting culture positively from our perspective. We did give the example of 9/11 being a negative influence, but I can't think of any positive.
I'm sure there are some out there. Probably one would be like Flint, Michigan, where that was just a situation that forced people to acknowledge the potential incompetence of government monopolies, of a government provides services and that sort of thing. That's the closest thing that I can think of as something that would have affected culture positively. I now know that all the water filters at the grocery store that I go to now all prominently advertise how much percentage of lead they remove from water.
Oh, very nice.
Yep.
Huh. Yeah, politics affecting the marketplace. Well, I heard this this study by Luke from We Are Change about how some agency took water samples from taps all around the country and found that like 90% of tap water contains microparticles of plastic and other pollutants and
I believe
stuff.
that.
We use a Brita filter. I don't know if...
We do as well.
Yeah. So try and keep it up to date. The wife gets the little filters in it and stuff.
I'm just seeing if Flint has water yet
Oh,
or not.
no, they don't.
They
I don't
don't.
think they do.
Flint water crisis to remain an issue through the 28 governor's election.
Oh, boy.
It's not that important.
Well, another thing that I wanted to talk about too is the pension crisis in the United. This is going to turn. So now we've talked about politics being downstream of culture.
Mm-hmm.
In the last, we're at 27 minutes right now. In the last 6 minutes, I'm going to be all doomsayer here.
Yep.
So the pension crisis, we're $20 trillion in debt and counting. And when the debt ceiling was lifted, and a lot of the listeners might already know this because it's been talked about, but when the debt ceiling was finally lifted, in one day, the debt shot up like $8 billion or $800 trillion in one day. Mm-hmm. Just crazy. I don't think it's going to last. And my mom was calling me the other day, and apparently they met with their financial advisor, and he's a mainstream Keynesian investor guy, and he's like, I don't mean to be a doomsayer, but the stock market is coming down. It has to come down. It's been expanding for the last 9 years since the last recession. And I said, well, and then he told them to get into the cash holdings and to get into bonds. And I'm like, it's a dollar crisis from my perspective. I don't see how... I'm worried about them a little bit, and I don't see how doing that is going to help them.
I've told my parents a couple times to just not expect to have... Don't count on Social Security when you're old. And they've kind of shrugged and sort of waved me off. So it goes.
Yeah, I think my parents know that they can't count on Social... Like, my parents are a little... I don't know. I've been trying to say, there's bad times coming, and I think I'm just a conspiracy theorist. At least I think my dad thinks that way. But, yeah, but I do worry about them. I do worry about what's in store. Maybe I should be more worried about myself, but
yeah, I'm not worried about my parents. They're solvent. They're also resourceful.
Yeah,
they'll be fine.
Yeah, mine are. I think what I do worry about is them losing what they have. But in the long run, I think they'll be just fine. I mean, they got guns. They know how to do stuff. So if things get that shitty, but then they have canned elk and stuff, so they can just trade that.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, pretty damn good. So yeah, we just decided to do a quick episode today. We were going to do an interview spot with the Peaceful Treason podcast, but that got pushed out another day. So we were like, oh, we're just here anyways. We might as well record something. This was an idea that I had been rolling around in my head a little bit. And I've heard it brought up several times. Mance Rader in our interview that was published recently, Liberty Weekly /32. We talked about this question a little bit as well. But just a lot of the normal stuff as we're closing up here. Sign up for our email list to get free copies of our ebooks. I've been getting a lot of email signups lately, actually. I think 4 in the last week. So very excited about that. Thank you guys for signing up for our email list. As well, we've been directing everyone to our Patreon, where you'll get early access to unedited audio, a whole bunch of other perks that if you're paying any attention at all, I won't recount because I've been plugging it a lot lately. But if you want to support our work, you like what we do, navigate to patreon.com/Liberty Weekly. Other than that, it's been a real good time. talking here and recording this podcast. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation as well.
Thank you.
Have a good one.